you'll get a reminder. There we go. Okay, so welcome to the 8th Roses Seminar, Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. This week, slightly unusual compared to previous weeks. I'm going to have my own initial presentation. So I'm going to share my screen first of all. And there we go. So welcome to the 8th Roses talk. We have Jamin Speer, who's going to talk to us. But before we get to that point, a few other things to mention. First thing is, many of you hopefully will have had an email this week about next week's Roses seminar. Next week, we're delighted to be joining forces with the Sports Economics and Sports Management 5th International Conference, which is going to be online this year with everything that's taking place. We're going to have we're going to fit in with the schedule. So I will send an email with the joining details, which now exist in terms of it will take place on Zoom, and we will be part of that. So next week, rather than join via Microsoft Teams, we will join via Zoom, and we will sit within the broader conference. So you're welcome as a member of the Roses team, the Roses seminars, to also take part in the SESM conference, which has got a fantastic lineup of includes many who have given talks and will give talks in the Roses seminar series, and many who are members of this. So thankfully we're able to coincide next week so that there isn't a choice of either or. In fact, Johan Rolak is going to give both a talk in the SESM conference, and he will give the Roses talk, which will be a slightly abridged version. So at 3:30 European time, 2:30 the usual time here, we will kick off the Roses seminar, and we'll have it slightly shorter. Johan will talk for about 30 minutes with a 15-minute Q&A. I also want to spend a bit of a moment. A couple of weeks ago, we marked a formative conference in the sports economics calendar, the Gijón Sports Economics Conference. There's another one which takes place and would have taken place currently, were it not again for coronavirus, and that's a conference that's taken place for the last 5 years in Cork, in Ireland. And here's a picture of the University College Cork, the quad, near to where the conference itself took place last year. I was fortunate enough to take part in the conference last year, and again many different well-known names in the field have taken part in this conference over the years. Many productive partnerships, collaborations and friendships have been kicked off through this. And I wanted to, at this point, just hand over to Robbie, Robbie Butler, who's one of the co-organisers of the conference. So I will de-share my slides just briefly. And Robbie, if you wanted to say a few things about your conference, it would be great to hear from you. You're on mute, Robbie. Just
I'm in the room now, right?
There you go.
Yeah, thanks for sharing it. Yeah, just first of all, thanks for acknowledging it. We would probably be all together in Cork right now if things have been different. And just look at people here today. Lots of people have been to Cork, Bernd, Brad, Rob, yourself. And it's an event we run every year. And hopefully we'll run it again next May, all going well. So it would have been the 6th event. Obviously that's not the case, so hopefully we'll have the 6th year in 2021. And then the other event we're looking forward to is the European Sports Economics Association Conference. So we were supposed to have that next year in 21, but that's been postponed now until 2022 to allow Helsinki to host it. So if we don't see you next year in Cork at the workshop, maybe you can come to the European Sports Economics event in 2022. But you know, we have a website, as you showed there, sportseconomics.org. So we regularly update that. People can check it out and see what we're at. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Robbie. If you put the link in the chat window as well, folk can navigate there as well that way. But thanks very much for saying a few words. And as you can see from my background today, we're jointly hosting this Roses talk with University College Cork, courtesy of Robbie and David Butler. But without further ado, Jamin sat there very patiently waiting in his Liverpool shirt. He's going to talk to us on the, just give him a bit more of an introduction. Jamin comes from the University of Memphis, associate professor there, and He claims that until watching a recent documentary, he wasn't particularly interested in sports economics, but he's now written a paper presenting it here on the consequences of relegation and promotion in European soccer leagues, a regression discontinuity approach. So, Jamin, the floor is yours. Please do share your slides and take it away.
Okay, thank you, James. Let me see if I can share my slides here. Can you see that? Is that up?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me to talk. I've really enjoyed the rest of the talks that I've been a part of so far, and so I'm happy to be on the program. And so you can see from the title, I'm going to talk about a topic that you've all probably thought about, every fan has thought about. The goal is to sort of combine this topic that we all think about, we all have examples to think of with our own teams, with a kind of modern, really powerful causal inference technique that is becoming very popular, which is regression discontinuity. So just a couple of disclaimers. As James said, I'm not usually a sports economist. This is my first foray into sports economics, but I've really enjoyed the talk so far. So I'm excited to learn from you all in terms of things I should be doing or things I should think about in this paper. It's definitely preliminary. There's a part at the end of the paper that if I get to it, you'll see is very preliminary because it's very back of the envelope. But we'll get to that, and maybe I can get some ideas from you. Okay, so the research questions are, what are the short and longer term consequences of relegation and promotion in major European soccer leagues? I am going to call it soccer. I'm American. Sorry if that, you all know what I'm talking about. So anyway, I'm going to think about what are the consequences for team performance. So, where do you finish? I'm going to think about the consequences financially. That's the part of the paper that's not as developed at this point yet. And a big part of this is going to be how long do the costs and benefits last? So we think of relegation as a very kind of devastating event and promotion as a huge event. But that kind of, dissipates if you go up and directly back down or down and directly back up. Whereas we can all think of teams that have stayed down for a long time or stayed up for a long time. So on average, what are the effects? And then what's the probability that you end up in a very bad situation if you have a bad outcome? And I'm going to do these I'm going to answer these questions using regression discontinuity. I'll explain what that means if you're not familiar with regression discontinuity. This is a causal inference technique that's really growing in popularity. So as an example, I saw a paper the other day that was analyzing NBER working papers. In 1995, 0% used regression discontinuity. By 2015, 10%. So this is really one of the techniques that is really taking off. Actually, this paper got started. This is probably the first paper I've ever done where it started by watching Netflix. Basically, I was teaching regression discontinuity to my graduate students here at the University of Memphis. And at the same time, I was making my way through this Netflix series, Sunderland Till I Die, which, if you haven't seen it or you're not familiar with what it's about, Sunderland were relegated in 2017. And this documentary, season 1, follows them the next season. And it's kind of billed as, we're going to follow Sunderland on their attempts to get back to the Premier League. But spoiler alert, doesn't work out so well. What happens in that season is they get relegated again to League One immediately, and just devastating financial consequences. So I was watching that and teaching regression discontinuity, and I thought, hey, this is a really good application of this technique. I think I'll look at it and basically ask, how typical is this? So is a team like Sunderland that really gets devastated by relegation, is that a common outcome? Is that the typical outcome? How common is that? Or is that kind of an outlier? So there you go, kids. Watch Netflix and you can get research ideas. I'm going to go through the motivation and a little bit of background. I know that for this crowd, you mostly know some of these things, so I'll go through this quickly. Promotion, relegation create a tremendous amount of excitement. So, games throughout from top to bottom in the league matter because of these things. Not just, games that determine the title or something like that, but this comes with huge winners and losers. So obviously some teams are going to benefit a lot from this system if they get promoted. Other teams really suffer. So we as the fans get to enjoy this excitement. As a neutral fan, you enjoy this excitement, but there's some teams that are kind of paying for that. And we know this can have big financial consequences. For example, I don't know if, here we refer to the promotion playoff as kind of the richest game in soccer. The financial consequences of that game are so huge. And of course, as James was mentioning before we got on, this is a major sticking point in the negotiations and the plans of how to finish this season. Will we have promotion? Will we have relegation? As James was mentioning, everybody wants promotion, but nobody wants relegation. So hard to see how that system works. But these costs and benefits really depend on how long lasting the effects are. Right. And it also says something about just the upward downward mobility in these leagues. Basically, the question of, if you see every team that's promoted go straight back down, well, that's telling you something about there's not a lot of upward mobility in these leagues, right? That it's really hard to break into the top group. On the other hand, if promotion has lasting benefits where you go up and you stay for a long time, well, that says that these leagues are not impossible to break into. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go through a very brief background and a theory section, which the theory section is really just if you talk to somebody and explain the system and they didn't know anything about the sport, what would they expect? That's kind of the theory section. We'll do some graphical analysis, the regressions, and then I'll talk about finances near the end. All right, so the background will be very brief because you know all of this. So European leagues operate on a promotion relegation system. That's the bottom finishing teams in the top division are relegated to the second division for next season. The top finishing teams from the second division are promoted to the top division for next season, and so on down the line for the lower divisions. These rules differ from country to country. They also differ across time. This is going to be a little bit difficult for me and how to do this empirically. So for example, in England, the bottom three teams in the Premier League are relegated. The top two teams in the championship are automatically promoted. And then teams 3 through 6 play a playoff for the final spot. And I have the stat in my paper. I was looking at how often the third place, fourth place, fifth place, and sixth place teams actually win that playoff. And third place is the most common, but not by a lot. And if I remember right, actually, I think fifth place is more likely to win than fourth place. So this playoff creates a lot of interesting, possibilities. Whereas if you go over to Germany, they have a different system. The bottom two teams in the Bundesliga are relegated. The top two teams in the second division are promoted. And then the I hope I said this correctly, the third place team in the second division plays the third from the bottom in the first division for the final spot. So you have some systems like this where there's a playoff between teams in different divisions. But that's recent. Before 2009, there was just automatic relegation for the bottom three teams, much like they have in England. So my point in saying this is just that these rules are not stable across places and across time. And so when I get to the empirical strategy, I'll have to deal with this. Basically, in a regression discontinuity, you have to define a threshold where if you're on one side of that threshold, you get one treatment. And if you're on the other side, you get a different treatment. But if the rules are changing over time, you have to think carefully about how do I define that. So I'll talk about that when I get to that. I was mentioning this to James. This is kind of an exciting, just everything about this is interesting to Americans because we don't have this. So if you're familiar with American sports, we don't have promotion and relegation. This was an article I found. I remember reading this years ago. Basically, they took college football in America and ran a 15-year simulation, just said what would happen to your team if there'd been relegation. So if your team ever finished at the bottom of its division, and we moved them down, what would happen? And they ran this for 15 years. And even in American soccer, MLS does not use promotion relegation. I think it's one of the only soccer leagues in the world that doesn't use this system. So this is a kind of a foreign concept to Americans and creates a lot of excitement for us. We have teams that finish at the bottom of their respective sports year after year after year. And of course, that wouldn't happen in one of these soccer leagues. Okay, so the theory section is going to be just 2 slides on like what would someone who doesn't know that much about this expect? So one question would be, well, okay, why might the costs of relegation be short term? Well, if you think about it, a relegated team was in the top division for some reason, right? So they somehow got into that top division. And so they probably had more top players, international players, highly paid players than teams that they're now competing against once they go down. And so if the team is able to keep those players, keep their manager, you would think they should go back up soon. So we saw this with Newcastle recently, I think, where Rafa Benitez said he'd stay their manager. even when they went down, and they came immediately back up. You had West Brom has done this. So these get referred to as yo-yo clubs that kind of go up and down, and that makes sense in some sense because you would expect, hey, this team was in the top division for a reason. They probably have some good players that can get them back up. On the other hand, obviously there's a massive drop in revenue when you move down to second division, and that requires selling a lot of your good players, right? And in fact, a lot of the players may want to leave because they don't want to play in the second division, and they may have better opportunities. So what happens to a lot of these teams is you may lose all your good players, lose your manager, and you may continue to fall. So we saw that with Sunderland, a team like Leeds that has fallen, that fell for a while there too. So you have these kind of competing effects of why teams might come right back up and why they might be lasting consequences. And then for promotion, you can kind of say the same thing. Well, if I get promoted, there's a reason I was in the second division to begin with, right? I probably don't have a lot of international players on my team. And even if I decide to go out and buy a lot of new players, that may disrupt the team chemistry, team flow, the style of play that I had before. So you've seen even some teams that try to go out and buy a lot of new players, it doesn't always work because you're kind of disrupting the style of play that got you to where you are. And so West Brom shows up again because they've gone up and down, up and down. And so you get these teams that go up and then directly back down, Fulham being one of the most recent. On the other hand, you get this massive financial gain, right? And so you can finance buying new players, you can get a better manager. And now you can recruit top players from other clubs. So just as an example, if one team is relegated, their best players may want to leave. Well, if I'm getting promoted, maybe I can buy those players away from them, right? And because they want to play for me because now I'm in the top division. And clearly you can have lasting success. We've seen, Leicester City promoted. That's kind of an extreme example, as is Manchester City. But even more moderate examples like a team like Stoke City that gets promoted and stays in the Premier League for a long time, right? So you don't have to win the league like these other two to achieve lasting success. So clearly this is possible. The question is, how typical is it? Okay. So that was kind of all the theory. There's more there. One thing I would really love, people can send me an email and that kind of thing. What I really need to kind of improve on this paper is thinking more about theory in terms of structure of competitions and that kind of thing. I know that a couple of the talks in this series have talked more about that in terms of like tournament theory and stuff like that. And I would love to add some of that into this paper. So if you want to send me anything, I'd be happy to look at some other ideas as to how to better motivate this and connect it to the broader economics literature. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is describe how regression discontinuity works and then show you some graphs. I'll point out ahead of time that in regression discontinuity, you usually see a lot of graphs. The graphs are not, the graphs are suggestive. You can't tell. There's actually been some talk on Twitter about this. You can't tell from looking at the graph if things are statistically significant. So just look at the graphs, but then I'm going to have to test all these things with regressions. Okay, but the graphs are kind of showing you what's going on. So I'm going to use, for now at least, I'm going to use data from England, Germany, France, and Spain, kind of in the sort of the modern era, 1993 to 2018. I started to put together the Italy data, and the Italian teams keep disappearing or getting sent down, 3 divisions at a time for scandals. So I decided to leave them out. But I think definitely in the future, I could add more countries to this analysis. So what do I have? Basically, all I need for each team year, I have where they finished, which division they're in, where they finished. I'm going to need their goal differential, and actually I have their points. That's going to be important as well. And of course, I have if they're relegated or promoted. I include every team that's been in the top division or anywhere near promotion. So basically every team that's ever played in the top division in that time period or has been in the top, 6 or so in the second division, which there's a lot of teams that sort of pop up there for a year and then disappear, never make it again. So that turns out to be 220 different teams, and I have kind of their record over time. One thing that's a little tricky to deal with is teams that disappear after these things have happened. So I haven't done anything really to deal with that. If you have ideas, let me know. But anyway, there's not too many of those, but there's a few. All right, so in terms of the empirical strategy, the goal is to estimate the consequences of relegation and promotion. And when you think about that, the big question is compared to who, right? Who's the control group? So these are endogenous outcomes, right? They're not randomly assigned treatments. We don't, randomly assign who gets promoted and who gets relegated. So this is not a randomized experiment. The teams that are relegated are different than the teams that are not relegated. Specifically, they're usually worse, right? So if you just compare outcomes of teams that are relegated to not relegated, that's not a good control group. So you're going to need to deal with that. I'm going to use a technique called regression discontinuity. And the idea with RD is that you compare teams just above and just below a threshold. Okay. And the idea is that on one side, I'll show you some graphs that'll make this clear. On one side of that threshold, a certain outcome is likely, like relegation. And on the other side of that threshold, that outcome is not likely. So an example in England would be, what if I compare 17th place, which is not relegated, to 18th place, which is relegated, okay? And the idea is that that's a better control group because those teams are similar, right? They might have even had the same goal differential. It's possible even the 17th place team was better. They might have had the same points. It's possible even the 17th place team was better by some measures like goal differential, right? So, but they're going to have very different outcomes because of this cutoff. And so this works, this RD technique works if two things are true. The first one's kind of easy to check, which is you need a discontinuity or a jump in the probability of some treatment at that threshold, right? So you need teams on one side to be likely to be relegated, teams on the other side to be unlikely to be relegated. The other thing you need to check is that there's not a discontinuity in other things. So you need to check to see that the teams that finish 17th are not very different from the teams that finish 18th. So this would not hold if, like, let's say I looked at the table every year and 17th place was 15 points ahead of 18th place, right? Well, then this would be a pretty bad comparison because there's a big discontinuity there in team quality. So I'm going to be able to check that. I'm going to look at points and goal differential to see if there's a big jump at those thresholds. And I would just say, especially for some of the maybe younger people on the call who are kind of looking for ways to go forward in sports economics, I think regression discontinuity is a technique that has a lot of applications. I'd be happy to talk about that with anybody who wants to if they want to email me. But anything in sports where you have a threshold, so just think about, Champions League qualification, for example. If you get this spot, you're in. If you get this spot, you're not in. Or, in American sports, I can think of some applications as well. So if you're looking for a way to kind of do sports econ, but connect to some of the methods that are becoming very common in applied microeconomics, and kind of speak that language as well as the sports econ language, I think this is a good technique to learn if you haven't already. And that's kind of why I got into this project. Was I was teaching this and I thought this is really powerful. I want to do this, but I hadn't actually used it in my own work, and so this seemed like a good possibility. So if you're interested in that and want to chat, just send me an email later. Okay, so graphically, what does this look like? So what I've done here is I've graphed the y-axis is the probability that a team is relegated. The x-axis is where they finish, where 0 is the last relegation eligible spot. Okay, so in England, 0 is 18th place. 1 to the right of 0 is 19th place, and 2 is 20th place, okay? On the left side, -1 is the first safe spot, so 17th, and then so on. -2 is 16th, etc. Okay, and you see this big jump in this is the discontinuity part, right? You see this big jump at the threshold in probability that a team is relegated. Now, you might be thinking, why doesn't it go from 0 to 1? Why isn't it 100% of the teams in spot 0 are relegated? Well, it is in England, because England has an automatic 3 down, 3 up, or 3 down at least. But remember, in some countries like Germany, the third team from the bottom is not guaranteed relegation. They just have to play a playoff. So there's a probability that they're relegated, but it's not guaranteed. So that's this relegation threshold. It's the last relegation eligible spot versus just above that. Okay. So in England, that's kind of sure relegation versus sure safety, 17th versus 18th. But in other countries, it's sure safety, that's finishing 15th in Germany, versus possibility of relegation. And that's fine. We're just going to have to deal with that in the regressions. This is a certain type of regression discontinuity where it doesn't go from 0 to 1, it just jumps up. But anyway, so you can see graphically there's a clear discontinuity there, as you'd expect, in the probability of being relegated. Now, what I want to do is what I call a placebo test. I want to check that the teams just above and just below the threshold are similar. In other words, the 17th place team doesn't get relegated, the 18th place team does, but how different are those? So if I'm going to compare them, I want to see that they were similar in terms of quality or similar enough. So the two, we could think of other measures of team quality. I'm going to look at just performance for that year. I'm going to look at points and goal differential. And what you'd like to see is that there's not, right? So if I go back, you see a big discontinuity in promotion and relegation probability. What you want to see in the next picture that I'm going to show you is you don't want to see a jump, right? You don't want to see that 17th place is way better than 18th place. Okay, so here are those pictures, and I'll be able to test if these are significant in a minute. These are point totals and goal differential, and you see that obviously as you move to the right on these pictures, you are moving to teams that finish lower in the standings. So obviously the 20th place team is worse than the 19th place team. And what we're looking for here is there a jump at that threshold? Another way to think about that is if I took away the red line, could you tell where the red line is supposed to be? Right? If I took away the red line, could you tell where the threshold is? I think the answer is no. I'll be able to test that in regressions. You see that obviously 18th place is, I'm using England language, even though I've got 4 countries in here. 18th place is worse than 17th place, but not more so than like 17th is worse than 16th or 19th is worse than 18th. So I'll be able to test this, and that's the same for goal differential. Maybe I worry a little bit here about the goal differential, the jump at the threshold, but again, I'll be able to test and see if there's anything there in the regressions. So far, I'm pretty encouraged that I've got this jump in relegation probability, but not in team quality. But again, I'll have to test that in regression form. Okay, here's the same for promotion. Now, it turns out it's harder to define what the promotion threshold is because the rules are different across countries. So what I'm going to show you is in these graphs is actually not what I use in the regression. I'll explain that in a minute. So what this graph is 0 is finishing 3rd place in the 2nd division, and -1 is finishing 4th place. So as you go from left to right, you've got 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st. And you see that definitely the probability of promotion is jumps at the threshold. The 6th, 5th, and 4th place teams have a chance of being promoted, especially in a place like England, which has a playoff, right? If you're 6th place, you can get promoted, but it's much lower than the chance of being 3rd place. Now, again, I don't think this is the best definition. It's just the nicest one for this graph. I'll tell you what I do here in a second. Okay. And then I can also check if the quality of team by points and goal differential has a discontinuity there. And I say it does not appear significant. I'm going to be able to test that. Obviously the 3rd place team is better than the 4th place team. But if you could pretty much draw a line from between 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd, right? You could pretty much draw a linear function between those, and you wouldn't see a discontinuity at the red line. So you could just draw a linear function through those teams. So I'll be able to test that. It does seem that the team on the right of these figures is the team that wins the 2nd division, and you do see that seems to be a big jump. So on average, there seems to be a big difference in quality between teams 1 and 2. So one team tends to dominate in these contests, but not between teams, say 2 and 3 or 3 and 4. Okay, but again, I'll be able to check that in regressions. Okay, so I like these figures. These are just to kind of motivate what we're looking for. What I've done is graph the distribution of where teams finish. This is for relegation. So the blue distribution is teams that finish third from the bottom. So these are teams that are highly likely to be relegated. And the red is teams that finish fourth from the bottom who are not relegated. Okay. And so if you look 1 year later, so just the year after, well, obviously there's a massive difference in where teams finish, right? Because the red team was not relegated. The blue team usually was relegated. And you see that 3 years later, that the gap has closed quite a bit. So now there's more overlap. There's a lot of teams that were relegated that 3 years later are back in the top 15 or top 20. But you also see the right tail of that distribution, that 3 years later, there are a significant, it's not a huge probability, but there are a significant number of teams that got relegated in year 0 and 3 years later are outside the second division. So they've been relegated again. Okay, and we'll be able to look at that. And the same with 5 years later, although you notice 5 years later, there's more overlap again, and then 7 years later, there's even more. But you can the point is you can still tell a difference for sure between the distribution 7 years later. So even 7 years after these teams that finished right next to each other, 7 years later, there's a big difference in where they are. Specifically, the red team is much more likely to be in the top 20 according to these figures, right? So which is generally means they're in the top division. So these pictures are suggestive that we've got some long-term effects, that these are long-lasting consequences of being on one side of this threshold versus the other. If I do the same thing for promotion, okay, again, the blue, so what I'm doing here, just to make the graphs look better, the blue is going to be finishing between 3 and 6 and getting promoted. So I did this because England does the playoff system. And the red is I finished 3rd through 6 and didn't get promoted. Okay, so I lost the playoff or whatever. Obviously, 1 year later, those teams are in very different spots. 3 years later, the gap has closed quite a bit, but it still seems like the blue team is doing better here, right? And then 5 years later, the gap has closed a lot to where these teams are pretty similar, right? So just based on this picture, which is not, there's no test of statistical significance here or anything like that. But just based on these pictures, it looks like, the effect of promotion maybe doesn't last as long. We'll see. Although you notice in the 5 years picture, in the bottom left, that if you look on the right side of that picture, the red line is above the blue line. What that's saying is the probability of being, in these very bad outcomes where you're finishing 50th or 60th in your system, is higher for the teams that didn't get promotion, which is kind of interesting to think about, right? Teams that were on the doorstep of promotion and then a few years later they're, out of the second division totally, and then 7 years later you can really see that, and so we'll look at that in the regressions here in a minute. So that was the graphs, and I think what we learned from the graphs, again, the graphs are just suggestive, but they suggest that at these thresholds, there are big jumps in treatment, promotion, relegation, but not necessarily big jumps in quality, yet years later, we can still tell a difference in outcome between these teams, okay? So that's what we're gonna do in the regressions. So how does this work? All right, so let's think of just the naive approach. So if I just, started from what's the most basic? Well, why don't I just regress the outcome for team I in year t+1, in year t+1, so like next year. All right, let's just regress next year's outcome on whether you were relegated this year. Okay, that would be the way to start. Well, this would be comparing relegated teams to non-relegated teams. And this is naive because relegation is endogenous, right? It's not randomly assigned. Random relegation is correlated with things in the error term like team quality, for example, right? There's a reason you were relegated. So what this is saying is non-relegated teams are a bad comparison group for relegated teams. And the same for promotion, right? Teams that didn't get promotion are going to be a bad comparison group for teams that did. So I'm going to use regression discontinuity, and I'll have to talk through relegation and promotion differently because they're slightly different. Relegation is what's called a fuzzy regression discontinuity. What that means is that at the threshold for relegation, the probability of relegation goes up, but not from 0 to 1. So we saw that in the picture I showed, where the probability of relegation on one side of the graph was 0, and on the other side was a lot higher, but not 1. And that's because there's these playoffs. Okay, so what you have to do in this case is you have to do an instrumental variable strategy. You do two-stage least squares, and you use crossing the threshold, so moving from the left side of the picture to the right side, as an instrument for relegation. Okay, so basically what you're doing is you're picking up the relegation that is induced by crossing that threshold. Okay, and if we think about our theory of instrumental variables, it's correlated with, so what you need is it's correlated with the treatment, relegation. That's going to be clear from the graph, right? That moving from one side to the other is correlated with getting relegated, but uncorrelated with other things like team quality. Okay, once you control for league position, which is called the running variable. So I'm going to be able to test that here in a second, where I'll have measures of team quality, and I'll regress that on where you finish. And then there's a dummy variable for crossing the threshold, basically, and that shouldn't be significant. So in other words, I shouldn't be able to tell. The team quality goes down as you get lower in the standings, but I shouldn't have a jump at that point. Okay. So when you do this, what you get, it's a two-stage least squares. What you get in the second stage is the outcome variable, which is going to be where you finish, and also I'm going to do another outcome I'm going to look at is the probability of being in the top division. You regress that on league position, so that's where you finish, and then relegated hat. So what is relegated hat? Relegated hat is the predicted value of relegated from the first stage. So relegation is being instrumented by crossing the threshold. Okay, and so when you do the first stage, you get a predicted value of relegation. That's this relegated hat. You stick that into the second stage. Okay. I also am going to include country and year fixed effects. I'll show you later on how these effects differ by country. I'll show you that they seem to a little bit, that it seems like relegation and promotion are actually better in some countries than others. And so if the assumptions are true, then gamma 2 gives the causal effect of relegation on outcomes. And I'm going to look at the next 7 years of outcomes. So year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you've ever done RD before, you know that you have to worry about the bandwidth, which is how many teams on each side of the threshold do I include. Basically, the idea there is the closer I get to the threshold, the more similar the teams are. Right, so it's a better comparison group. On the other hand, I need enough sample size to actually estimate these things, so I need to include teams on both sides. So I'm using 3. It's kind of the natural thing. I can't do more than that, because if you think about the relegation threshold, the 3 below that are 18th, 19th, 20th. Well, I can't go below that. I don't want to include teams from the championship or the second division in my regression. Okay, so I'm including 3 teams on each side. I'm not sure what else I can do there, really. Okay. All right. So let's look at these kind of placebo tests, which is to say, is there a significant effect of relegation on team quality in that year? There shouldn't be. If this is a valid approach, there shouldn't be. I should see 0 effect of relegation on points and on goal differential. These are kind of measures of team quality. And so what I do is I use those 2 variables as outcome variables, points and goal differential, and in fact, I do get 0 effect. The running variable is league position. So what this is saying, this 2.830, what this is saying is moving, let's see, make sure I say this right, finishing 1 position higher in the standings is associated with 2.8 more points in the standings. And once you control for that, relegation doesn't have an effect. So in other words, there's points are going down as you go down the standings, but there's not an extra jump at the relegation threshold. hopefully that makes sense. And also for goal differential, finishing one position lower in the standings means your goal differential was 3.7 goals worse. But once you control for that, there's no effect of being on one side of the threshold versus the other. Okay, so what this is saying is it seems like the approach is valid, meaning once I control for where teams finish, the teams on the right side and the left side are not different. So there's not a jump in team quality where the 18th place team is way worse than the 17th place team. Okay. All right. So this is the main results that I have for relegation. So each coefficient here is from a different regression, where I do years after relegation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I have outcome variables. I have league position, so where do you finish? And I have the probability of being in the top division. In year one, the probability of top division doesn't make any sense because one team is in the top division, the other one's not. It's just it's undefined because one of them is definitely in, one of them is definitely out. Okay. You see that in the first year after relegation, the team that is relegated and the team that is just not relegated, they finish 11.5 places apart. So on average, the team that's relegated is finishing like 26th, which means they're finishing like 6th or so in the second division. And the team that's not relegated is finishing about 15th. That's kind of the average, the averages that you're seeing. So that's a difference of 11 spots. About half of that goes away in year two. So in year two, they are about 5 spots apart in the system, right? And then in year three, it's about 4. And it's going to stay about 4 for the rest of the sample period. So about 4 spots apart. Unfortunately, I lose significance after year 3. This is what's telling me maybe I need to add more countries or something. The problem with going back in time more is the rules changed in some countries more before that, and the financial situation is very different. So I'm not sure I want to do that, but I could add some more countries to the sample just to try and get these standard errors down and get more significance. But we're seeing from the point estimates that even 7 years later, the average difference between a relegated team and non-relegated team is about 4 positions in the standings. So not significant, but it's definitely still there. And then the probability of being in the top division is also significant, is actually still significant at 7 years. If I look at 4 years, there's about a 20 percentage point difference in the probability you're in the top division between the relegated team and the non-relegated team. So these are persistent effects. I can also look at very good and very bad outcomes. So I'm going to define very good as being in the top 10, right? And then I'm going to define very bad as being outside the second division. And what you actually don't find anything significant in the regressions, but I'm just going to graph these to show you. Did I do it this way? I don't think, okay. I think what's going on here is the blue is either third, no, that's right, sorry. The blue is third from the bottom, the red is fourth from the bottom. So the red team was not relegated. And you see that the red team has a higher probability of being in the top 10. It's actually very high when you think about it. These are teams that just missed being relegated, and the next year they have a 30% chance of being in the top 10. So that's kind of actually, if you just miss relegation, you could do really well in the coming years. And the relegated team is lower. And then especially, I think the one on the right is interesting. This is the probability of being outside the second division. And you see that after 7 years, the blue team's chances of being outside the second division is about double. It's not super common, right? It's like 5.5% versus 2.5% for the team that didn't get relegated. But that's still suggestive, that if you get relegated, you are facing a higher chance of ending up, tumbling down. So Sunderland is not necessarily representative of what usually happens, but they're not an extreme outlier either. Okay. And by the way, they're not in, let's see. No, they are in the data because anyway, I didn't do 2019, but they got relegated in 2017. So anyway, okay. So this is, let's look at promotion. So what are the effects of promotion? Well, it's a little bit difficult to define the threshold because of the differing rules. So what I'm going to do, and if you want to talk about this more, I'd be happy to answer questions later. What I'm going to do is define it as if there's an automatic promotion. So like how it used to be in France, for example. I'm just going to use third place versus fourth place. That's the most straightforward. Third place is promoted, fourth place is not. If there's a playoff, which I think is actually how most countries use a playoff now, I'm going to use winning the playoff versus losing the playoff. So these are teams that both made it to the doorstep of promotion, and they just one game decided the difference. Okay. Now, with this definition, it's actually this actually becomes what's called a sharp regression discontinuity, which means that if you're on one side, you're definitely promoted. So the probability goes from 0 to 1. And that simplifies things in the regression because you don't actually have to do these instrumental variables. You can just put the promotion threshold directly in the regression. The reason that's good is A, easier to write the code for, B, smaller standard errors. So that's the big thing, is I can get more significance because I don't have to do this IV strategy, which tends to inflate the standard errors. Okay, so I can just put promoted directly in the regression. Let's do these placebo tests. We find that promotion doesn't have an effect on points or goal differential. So teams that finish one spot lower have 3.2 points or 3.2 points worse than the teams that finished above them. But once you control for that, the promotion itself doesn't have an effect. So that's good. That says there's not a jump in kind of team quality. All right, here are the main effects of promotion using those regressions. So what this says, a negative on the league position means you're finishing higher because, right, so like 15 versus 25. So the promoted team finishes 13 or 12.987 spots higher than the non-promoted team. Which again, these are teams that finished next to each other the previous year. So there's kind of a gap opening up in that. And then that stays significant for at least 6 years. This is the nice thing about getting slightly smaller standard errors is that, 3 years later, they're 5.6 spots apart. 6 years later, they're still 4.6 spots apart. So there's still a significant difference in where teams are finishing 6 years after one just achieved promotion and one just missed. There's also a significant difference in the probability that they're in the top division. Now that's going down. What's happening is some promoted teams go back down and some non-promoted teams later go up, right? So there's some mixing there, but the probability that you're in the top division is higher even 6 years later for the teams that got promoted in year 0. Okay, so these are pretty persistent effects. These are these very good and very bad outcomes. The probability of being in the top 10, first of all, these are kind of low. So if you get promoted, your chance of making it to the top 10 seems not very high. And that seems to go away like by year 5. So 5 years after one team was promoted, the other's not, those two teams have an equal chance of being in the top 10. So if, I think there's I keep using England examples, even though there's other countries in the data. There's a year I think where Leicester just barely missed promotion. Obviously, they got promoted later and then ended up being in the top 10. So some of these teams that just missed promotion end up doing just fine. But if you look at the right side, teams that just miss also have a much higher chance of ending up out of the second division altogether. So, and teams that get promoted, their chance is lower. So this is kind of suggestive that just like relegation, if you just miss promotion, your chances of sliding down are higher, which is kind of surprising if you think about it, right? These are teams that, maybe one goal in the playoff would have gotten them in or something. And 5 years, 7 years later, they find themselves playing in League One, which is kind of, surprising to think about. Okay, so this is just the estimates I showed you in the tables. Blue is relegation, red is promotion, just to compare them. They're pretty similar. So the effect of relegation is pretty similar to the effect of promotion. It looks like the effect of promotion is a little bit bigger in these middle years, so a little bit more persistent. I can also show you the effects across countries. These are very noisy because when you do it for each country, you cut the sample in fourths, right? So it's getting noisier. But if you look at these pictures, it looks like the effects of both of these are higher in England and Spain. What that's saying is if you get relegated in England or Spain, your chance, it lasts longer, right? Your chances of staying down seem to be higher. Whereas it looks like in Germany and France, there's more going directly back up. And I actually did this morning, so I haven't dug into why that's true or anything like that. And obviously the samples are not huge here, but the same for promotion. You see that England and Spain have higher effects there. So if you get promoted in England or Spain, it seems to last longer. You seem to benefit longer. And maybe that's being driven by some outliers, Manchester City's in the sample, Leicester City's in the sample. I'd have to think about Spain. I don't know who that would be in Spain. And then Germany and France, you have a smaller effect. So I don't know if that's significant or if that's just kind of driven by a couple outliers. I can dig into that more, but it looks like there is a difference. England and Spain look a little bit different than Germany and France. Okay, let me just, I'm wrapping up soon here. So for the on-field results, relegation, there's a significant impact on finish for at least 3 or 4 years. The point estimates suggest it lasts longer than that. After about 7 years, there's still a 4-place gap. And there's also a twice as high probability of these very bad outcomes, right, if you got relegated. And for promotion, the significance lasts a little bit longer, at least 6 years in my regressions. And also you have a 1/3 as high probability of very bad outcomes if you got promoted. And the top, this top 10 advantage, the probability being in the top 10 seems to go away after maybe about 4 years though. So it doesn't seem like on average, again, we're talking averages here. It doesn't seem like on average promotion helps you get in the top 10 necessarily, but it does help you kind of stay in the league for longer, which of course financially is going to be a big benefit. So let me move to the last part of the paper, which is definitely the most speculative, the least developed part of the paper, which is the financial consequences. There are people listening to this right now who know way more about finances and can help maybe direct me to what data should I collect and how should I do this. So these outcomes obviously can have massive financial consequences. But how big those consequences are depends on the persistence of the effects, right? So we talk about promotion being incredibly valuable financially, but that's going to be more true if you stay up than if you go back down. It's still valuable if you go right back down, but in terms of how much that's worth, it depends on how long you can stay up, right? So I'm going to use England as an example here, just because you can't necessarily calculate the financial consistently across countries. And this is going to be very back of the envelope. This needs to be improved. So here's what I'm going to do. Being in the Premier League brings massive financial windfall. So for example, the 20th place team, the last place team, was paid about $125 million US in 2019. Teams in the championship do not get that. Okay. In England, there's these parachute payments, right, where a relegated team gets 2 years of payments from the Premier League to cushion the blow of relegation. So this is, if you think about it, this is going to increase the value of promotion, because if I can just manage to get in the Premier League for 1 season, I've guaranteed myself at least 3 years of good finances, right? 1 year in the Premier League and then 2 years of parachute payments. And it's also going to cushion the blow of relegation because I at least have 2 years of getting some money. So what I'm going to do, or what I want to do here, is calculate the stream of revenue for teams that are relegated versus teams that didn't get relegated, and then do the same for teams that promoted versus not promoted. And I'm going to use the estimated effects from my regressions. So I know, for example, I know that if you're in the Premier League, you can get a certain amount of money. And if you're not, you don't get that money. But there's some probability, there's a difference in probability in being in the Premier League between the promoted and the non-promoted teams, and that gap is narrowing over time. So I haven't considered things that I should, like I haven't looked at the wage bill. So I haven't considered the fact that when you get promoted, you also spend more. I haven't looked at attendance. Okay, so there are things that are not in this analysis that need to be. But let's just see what I've got for now. Okay, so don't quote me on this. Please don't, James, don't send this to the BBC with your next projection. Don't say economist says it's worth this much. Okay, this is speculative at this point. Hopefully we can get to that point at some point. All right, so here's what I did. So what this table shows, the non-relegated team. Oh, sorry. The bottom line is the non-relegated team. The first year they are in the Premier League, which I've assumed they finish 18th. Okay, which this is the kind of payment they would get from the Premier League, and they get $131 million. Okay. Again, there's other things to consider there, but let's just go with it for now. The just relegated team is going to get a parachute payment, which I believe this year is about $51 million. Okay. Now, what I've done for the future years is I take the probability that that team is still in the top division and multiply it by what you would get in the top division. So like an expected value. And you see that these numbers start to narrow because some of the teams in the top row, the relegated row, start to move into the Premier League, and some of the teams in the non-relegated row start to move out. Okay, and I'm just going to add those up, and I'm going to use a discount rate, I think of 0.95 or maybe 0.9, I don't remember. And the difference over 7 years between those is $225 million US. Okay, again, there's things left out of that. It's just a start. What's interesting is if I cut out the parachute payments, if I just assume the parachute payments don't exist, which is not really a thing to do because the parachute payment, and when you take those away, they might affect the on-field performance, but I'm just going to cut out the parachute payments here and say, how does that change? And what it does is it increases the cost of relegation because you don't get that cushion in the first couple of years. So it goes up to 262 million, okay, for the discounted. Because if you look at the relegated team, I gave them nothing in the first year, where I didn't give them their parachute payment, right, in the first 2 years. Okay. So again, speculative, but clearly, there's a big financial consequence. I can do the same for promotion with parachute payments. I'm going to add those up. They add up to $280 million. And then with no parachute payments, that goes down to $238 million. Okay. Again, the parachute payments increase the value of promotion because even if I get promoted for 1 year, and I finish 20th, I don't even, win a single game, I am guaranteed that year plus 2 more years of big payments. And so that's going to really make promotion super valuable. Okay, so again, this is very back of the envelope, and I know I need to improve it. But the summary of this was that, discounted relegation costs $225 million over 7 years, promotion about 280. I'd like to incorporate other things. Eliminating the parachute payments increases the cost of relegation, but lowers the benefit of promotion. Okay, so the parachute payments, I think, are designed to cushion the blow of relegation, but as kind of an interesting consequence of that is that they also really increase the value of promotion, just because if you get up there for 1 year, you have several good years. Okay, so I've solved the issue for every team. Clearly, teams should go to great lengths to achieve promotion or avoid relegation. Right, so there we go. Simple. You're welcome. I'm sure teams will come wanting to hire me as a consultant now. Okay, but obviously that's risky, right? So if I could spend $100 million to achieve promotion and I knew it was going to work, I should do it. But if I do that and I don't achieve promotion, I'm in a lot of trouble. So that's a very risky strategy, and probably that is a cause of a lot of these bad outcomes we see, is that teams overspent. Really trying to get that big payday, and then it didn't work, and they end up in a lot of trouble. Okay, so let me conclude, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions. So using RD, regression discontinuity design, I find that these promotion and relegation both have consequences that last many years. Just missing promotion or just getting relegated, these increase the chance of ending up in a very bad situation, like outside the second division, and then of course these big financial consequences. If I sort of zoom out and think about what does this mean, well, the lasting benefits of promotion show that it's possible for teams to rise up and achieve lasting success. Now, there are definitely examples in England of wild success of promoted teams, and if you think about these, they all seem to be being taken over by very rich people. So Leicester City, Manchester City, and then Wolves more recently. So that seems to be really the key to success. But even, milder success can be achieved and sustained. You think about teams like Stoke City or Southampton that get promoted and then just become Premier League mainstays. They're not going to win the league anytime soon, but they've been, consistent good achievers. That seems to be, very possible as well. On the other hand, and then the lasting costs of relegation show it's difficult to bounce back from relegation. We can all think of these examples that come, these teams that come right back up. I'm sure when our team gets relegated, we think, well, we're just gonna bounce right back up. That's what the makers of the Sunderland documentary thought, and that is certainly possible, but it's not typical. And so overall, I think these results show that there's plenty of upward and downward mobility. And you see that when you start to look at the data. You see teams that are in the third division and become, successful in the first division. And so that's definitely possible. It's also possible to move down. I think that does create a lot of the excitement. Is it's not just the same teams cycling through. You actually do get teams that jump up, and so James, there's hope for your team after all. You do get teams that make those kind of jumps and are successful. But at the flip side of that is your team could become one of these examples of getting stuck in the second or third division. Although one thing I want to dig into more is this difference that I found between the countries. This upward and downward mobility seems to be more robust in England and Spain than Germany and France. I'm not sure why that is. If you have thoughts, I'd love to hear that. But anyway, I will stop there and answer any questions that you have or hear your ideas. I would also love for anybody to email me with ideas afterwards. I know that I don't know if Brad's on the call, but he sent me some comments the other day that were very helpful on my paper. And so all of you on this call know more about sports econ and sports econ literature and finances than I do. So I'd be very happy to hear your ideas and your thoughts. So that's all I got, James. Thanks for having me, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jamin. That was really, really interesting. Covered an awful lot of stuff there in a lot of depth, and there's a lot of conversation that was generated in the chat room. So I'll try and summarize that. So to answer your question about whether Brad's in the room, yes, he is. And his first contribution was to mention that there's a paper by Roger Knoll from the 2002 journal Sport.
Yeah.
The nature of treatment of promotion. There's agreement with you that regression discontinuity is, or sports examples in the RD kind of area are really interesting and more interesting, she finds, than lots of other examples. And Carl Singleton asks, what about the time before the end of the season that a team was safe from relegation or out of the promotion race rather than their final position? Because it can be the case that a team can be mathematically relegated and then win a few games to boost their position relative to what they're.
That's a great point. That could be that could show up is that could be messing up my quote unquote proof that teams that are 17th and 18th are not that different is looking at the final standings. It could be that there was a big gap and then the 17th place team stopped playing hard, and that is possible. Now that would take more work to go back, and because I have to look at standings at different places during the year. I mean, in general, when you think about RD, it's a problem if people can manipulate their position on either side. Here, I have to think about that, but that's absolutely a valid point. I think it would just be more work, but I could try and find out at least, what the date is each time. Like, what's the date each year that the last non-relegated team is safe or something like that. And if it's early, that does cause a problem for me. If it goes down to the last day, I'm fine, right? But that's a totally a good point. So thank you for that.
We can chat about that as well, because I've got a fairly a way that we can calculate that based on code that I already have. So we can
great.
Kind of related is something that sprung to mind for me was points deductions. Do you factor any of those in? Do you know about any of those?
That's a great question. I'm not sure what I'm doing, or if anything. I need to look into that. Yeah, it's not obviously it's not very common, but it's not. But I can.
So what often happens is these deductions can be gamed as well. So, for example, they can't happen after about March the 26th in England. And so there was discussion, because my team, again, I hate to bring my team into it, but they began your sample in the Premier League, ended it in League Two, and also flirted with administration and insolvency within the last few months. And there was talk about whether or not it would be optimal to go into insolvency before or after March the 26th.
Okay.
So, completely ignoring the effects that we've had since the coronavirus. But if you go into administration post March the 26th, it's added on to your next season's or deducted from your next season's total.
Okay. I definitely haven't done anything to deal with that. So we can talk about, if anybody has ideas, about exactly what to do. That's a good point.
I mean, the main thing for you is probably that some teams will also invoke or go into administration. So Portsmouth and Leeds United are examples I can think of that did this. The moment that relegation was confirmed, I think Bolton as well, they go into administration and take that points hit rather than have it for the next season. But that makes the gap between, I guess, these teams in points much bigger than it might have been.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so I need to think about whether, I mean, the point of using the points is kind of a measure of team quality. So I sort of wouldn't want the adjusted points. On the other hand, if you know you're getting a point deduction, that might affect your performance. So, okay, that's a great thing to think about.
And Carl also said a nice graphical robustness check, maybe position in January the 1st or 31st against the finishing position.
Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Then Carl also asks, the answer is yes, that this is all Premier League era. And you mentioned this about comparing to other countries versus going back historically.
I actually could go back historically. So I'll be honest. When I started collecting the data, and started thinking about this, I actually wanted to include things like Champions League qualification as another discontinuity, and those rules really changed going back. And so I decided to kind of stick to the modern era. Maybe now that I'm just doing these, I could go back further. I mean, that's possible. Now I think the financial part, like, you'd have to sort of have a fixed effect for modern era, because I think the financial differences are pretty different between the modern era and the old. But there may not be a good reason why I can't go back further, which would increase my sample. So maybe I can do that. Yeah. For now, I mean, these are Premier League era. So, but maybe I could go back across the country. I have to think about whether it's smarter to do that. Like which one's a bigger benefit, to go back to the 70s or to add in Portugal and the Netherlands or something. But I guess I could go back. I had sort of ruled that out previously, but maybe I shouldn't have.
And related to your point about Europa League, Champions League, Brad suggested that a very good outcome might actually be from top 10. So.
That's a good idea. I could also include that as a I mean, one thing that James and I were talking about the other day, maybe this is a free idea for somebody else, because I'm not sure I'll get to it, is it could, if you could use this kind of design to look at the effect of getting into the Europa League, and it might have a negative effect on your future performance. So these teams that maybe they don't have enough players to really compete in all these competitions, and they get in and they move down the table, or Chelsea misses out and then wins the league the next year, because they don't have to travel to Azerbaijan in midweek. So that could be an interesting application. Maybe somebody could work on that with me or something. But that's a great idea, Brad, to use that as a really recognizable outcome as far as very good.
And then we went into a little bit of a side discussion, but it was related to one of your comments about you reflected that it might be that Spain and England, perhaps, relative to France and Germany, said that they do promotion and relegation better. And so it made me think about what would better mean in terms of promotion and relegation.
Right. I mean, so what I found is the effects are more persistent. The effects are larger. So basically, teams that go down stay down longer, or teams that come up stay up longer. I don't know. You have to define some kind of social welfare function as to what you want. It seems like you want. It's funny because we talked about how teams want promotion but not relegation. It seems like as a fan, you'd want promotion to have a big benefit. So if I get up, I can stay up, but you'd want relegation to have a small cost, right? If I get relegated, I can come right back up. And those may not be. So I don't know what's better or worse. I mean, it's better. I mean, it's there's more churning. or maybe that's not the right word. There's more opportunity for upward and downward mobility, but those go together. So, and I don't know what it is about, I don't know if it's just the way the quality of teams is distributed. I'm not sure what it is about. Somebody might have an idea about the financial situation or something, if that's a reason why Germany and France look different. But yeah, that's it. I mean, I'm open to ideas about that, or looking into that. That's the first thing I've looked at across countries, mostly because I don't have the sample to do it yet. That I could go back further, and then I'd have a bigger sample for each country, which might help me dig into the cross-country differences. I'm not sure I can do that much right now, but if I doubled the sample, I could do that.
Yeah. So then Kerry perhaps asks you a boring econometric question, which is, are you clustering your standard errors?
Oh, the classic seminar question in applied micro. Answer is no. I'd be interested to hear, where I should cluster them. My intuition about these kind of things is bad.
The reference is apparently Lee and Card 2008, and they recommend clustering by the running variable when the running variable is discrete.
Okay, great. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
There's a screenshot of the reference in the chat window as well, so you can chase that up later.
Okay, that's perfect. Yeah.
We then based the discussion carried on with Brad and Dennis on this promotion and relegation question, and the question would be whether you would want. So I think you've shown the effects, or maybe I got this wrong, but you seem to show the effects weren't necessarily symmetric between promotion and relegation.
They don't have to be. Yeah, I mean, it's not necessary that they have to be. I mean, they're pretty similar in my thing. So were there comments about what were some of the thoughts about that? Because that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious of necessarily trying to paraphrase what Brad and Dennis have been saying. Basically, the question is whether leagues might want that, whether clubs might want that. My impression is that the parachute payments kind of from the Premier League appear to inject something of a statement about the structure of it, because it's explicitly affecting what happens with promotion and relegation, although perhaps to only a subset of the clubs that exist in the lower divisions.
Yeah, and that's something that I have not done in terms of I need to find out sort of when have parachute payments existed and in which countries, like what are the years? Because if there's enough, I can test sort of, does the existence of parachute payments change these effects? Does it do kind of what it's designed to do, which is cushion the blow of relegation? So that's something I can look into, because I think you're right that in terms of what they want, what kind of system they want, that is kind of a statement of, it's revealed preference of what they're interested in.
Yeah. Andrew asks, or says that it could be interesting to look also, as well as you're obviously looking at first to second division, assuming across these major leagues, it might be interesting, and again, increases your sample size with due care and attention to the rules. But if you looked at Divisions 2 to Divisions 3, Divisions 3 to Divisions 4, because obviously parachute payments don't exist between those leagues.
That's a good idea. I could do that. I think, I could do that. I mean, you don't have the big financial disparity between second and third division as much as between first and second, so you might find something quite different. I think once you go down too far, you start to run into more teams disappearing from the sample, which I didn't have to worry about too much in this, but you could do that more. But that's another possibility. I mean, I think all these options to increase the sample could help me just get more significant results, especially if I'm going to cluster the standard errors, because that will take away some of my significance. So
And then Dennis Coates asks, I was curious about a couple of the slides showing the results where one graph was horizontal for several years before rising. Could you say something about that?
Okay.
And if you want to unmute your mic just to point out which slide in case we don't go to the right one.
You went past one of them. Well, there's one right there. So the red on the right for
Yeah.
6 years is at 0, and then boom, it jumps.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, so these are our teams fourth from the bottom. So these are the non-relegated teams. So it makes sense that it'd be 0 at the start because you didn't get relegated. So, you've got several years. Yeah, so one question that I actually look up is how many teams is that, right? What's this jump? How many teams is that's causing that? I will say one issue with these. Yeah. Okay. I can look into that. I can try and figure out, who that is, or is there something, or is that just random noise?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was my concern. Is it just seems
Yeah.
it seems very random, and there was another couple of slides that had similar kind of patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this one too, you get this big down.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I can look into that. I mean, these are, if you look at the y-axis, these are pretty unlikely outcomes. So if it happen, if one or two teams have that happen, it makes a big change in the graph. I can look into that. I can definitely look into that. One thing I should say, kind of related to what you're asking, but not exactly what you're asking. When you look at a table like this where I show 7 years of results, the sample is actually changing as you go down, because when I'm looking 7 years out, I can't include the 2015 teams, for example, right? So the sample is actually shrinking as I go down. I have done everything with a consistent sample, so basically cutting off the most recent years and just taking everything that I can actually see 7 years after, and it doesn't change anything, so that's good. But yeah, these big jumps are from 4% to 1.5% is a big change in 2 years. So whether that's just one team moving up and down, or something, I can look into that. Thanks, Dennis.
Then Hoge Tovar asks, does history matter? Number of seasons in the first division when you return to the second division, say? And so he says when, say, Valencia or Atletico Madrid got relegated versus other smaller teams.
I see. I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, I haven't thought about that. Yeah. On the other hand, didn't help Leeds, but did maybe help Newcastle. So, yeah, I mean, I can. That's something I can estimate from what I have. So I wouldn't need to collect anything more for that.
Yeah, I think if you want to look at those kinds of questions, you probably want financial data.
Yeah.
But I would have thought, because that gives you some sense. And you mentioned in terms of the gaps between the divisions. Certainly in England, it's the case that you have the Premier League stratospherically high balances. Championship is obviously somewhere below that, but then when you get to League One, League Two, they're actually not very different from each other. And that's one of the things that Stefan's talk a few weeks ago made clear. Just to tie you up on something before we open it up, Andrew Eckart says some of related literature is the one where firms drop into and out of big indices, so S&P 500, the FTSE 100, and so on, and the impact that has on firms. And so that there may be literature there that you could get ideas on.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good idea. It's a good idea.
And so that's and Matthew also points out that, and we chatted about this yesterday, I think, is that at some point in the past, most leagues only have 2 points for a win rather than 3 points for a win.
Yeah, so I that's right. So going back to the early part of my sample, you get some of that. What I did it's not going to affect the main results because it's only for a few years in my sample. But what I did is convert all those to 3 points for a win. Which the interesting thing about that is there are some teams that if it had been 3, like they got relegated and wouldn't have gotten relegated if you just adjust the points. So there are a couple of years, it's only 2 or 3 years in my sample, where the team that's relegated in the data I'm using has more points than the team that's not relegated because I adjust. Yeah. Again, that's only a couple of years. I could just exclude those. I could just drop those if people think that's a problem. Luckily, it's only like 1993 to 95 in a couple of countries or something. But yeah, it's a good thing to flag and make sure I'm robust to that.
And then finally, before we open it up, Tunde has nipped in with a final question, which is a bit cheeky, which is, given your tire, how would you feel if the current Premier League season was voided due to the pandemic?
Not good. Not good. I'm on sort of a Facebook Messenger group with kind of my American Liverpool friends, and there was a lot of panic going on. I think when let's see, so who was it that when Netherlands voided the season and didn't name a champion? Yeah, that was causing some consternation. So. Yeah, well, of course, I think Liverpool needs 2 wins to clinch the season, so we're like, just let them play 2 games, then you can cancel it. Yeah, I would not feel so good about that. We were talking about this before. The exposure of European soccer in the U.S. is not a long-term phenomenon. So it started coming on television really mostly when I was in high school, and so my history doesn't go back super far, but been a pretty strong Liverpool fan for about 15 years. Didn't understand at the beginning that they weren't in the Champions League every year. I learned that during some of those years. But yeah, I would not feel great about that. I'm luckily any of the systems you want to do, points per game, weighted points per game, James's projections, any of those will work as long as you name a champion.
It's the only one where there's no doubt about it. Everywhere else, it could be one, could be another. But what I want to do for the last few moments is particularly for the benefit of Stefan, because he did want to ask questions, but he's unable to use the chat function.
Okay.
If you do want to ask questions, Stefan in particular, please
Should I stop sharing my slides for that, or should I leave them up?
Maybe leave them because there might be the reference to the slides.
Okay.
Thanks, James. A great paper, Jimmy. I really enjoyed it. So I have a couple of comments.
Sure.
The first is that in some sense, when you're thinking about financial distress, you're looking in the wrong place here. I mean, the data I've got for England, Germany, and France shows that there's very little financial distress in the first and second tiers. It's when you get relegated to the third tier. Daniel Weimar, my co-author on the German paper, said some fans describe Bundesliga 3 as the league of death because you're so likely to get into insolvency when you get relegated. That's certainly true in England and France as well. And so, I mean, looking at the lower tiers, I mean, that would be a much easier way for you to expand the size of your data set as well, rather than going back in time when things get very different. I think you'd be much better off just expanding the number of divisions. And the lower down you'll go, you'll see much bigger effects.
Okay.
So the second thing I was going to say was, though, I was just wondering just generally about the application of the regression discontinuity approach in this context. So when I think of the sort of archetypal application of this, you think of the classic study of were they high school students who were qualifying for some scholarship, and they looked at the point scores for people who just below and just above the qualification, and then the long-term implications for their earnings, and that was clearly made a big difference, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of education applications for sure. Yeah.
Right. Well, in this case, this is sort of structurally very different, because it's not. If you miss out on a scholarship going to university, that's a permanent effect, and you can't really go back and redo it. Whereas here, the clubs are coming back every year and redoing it. So in some sense, it's almost a question of what is the event here? Is the event missing out on a promotion this year? Or is the event, should we think of the event as being missing out of promotion over a 5-year period, over a 10-year period?
That's a great point. Yeah.
So just something for you to think about.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, basically what you're saying is it's not a 0-1 treatment, it's the timing of treatment, right? So teams that did not get promoted this year might get promoted next year. And so it's a little bit arbitrary to think of just the effect of this year. I mean, I think, okay. I have to think more about that. I think that's a great comment.
Would be relegated and never promoted back again, or promoted and never, and there are no such clubs, right? So
I mean, that's right, and you run into obviously a lot more endogeneity problems there, because that's a pretty selected sample, right, of teams that get close and never come back, which there are quite a few in the sample. So I mean, so I totally agree with what you're saying. I think that's really interesting, and it is different, and maybe I should think more about that. There's probably, I should ask my kind of applied micro friends about that, about are there RD examples where the treatment is kind of happening each year. Can you get treated again? There is one. So there are some in education like that, and I need to look at that more, because there are some about sort of each semester at college, do you get kicked out of school for having a low GPA versus just staying in. But if you just stay in, you could get kicked out the next semester. So there's kind of this same idea of that the treatment could happen again the next time. And so I need to talk to people about that, to think about whether that, yeah. Okay, that's a great comment. Thank you, Stefan.
Anybody else want to unmute microphones and ask any questions?
And of course, if anybody has any comments that they don't want to share with the group, I'm happy to get emails or Twitter chats or whatever with your ideas. This is very helpful to me, so thank you.
The final point in the chat window is Matthew has pointed out other rule changes that happened in, I think, during your sample, was the back pass rule. So okay. I think it was about 1994 when the back pass was outlawed, because that obviously then changed how cagey teams could be, the tactics involved, and arguably led to a more attacking game, and maybe larger differences between points totals and so on. Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm happy to play around with excluding anything. I have country fixed effects. I have year fixed effects. So I'm not too concerned about that. But it's a fair point that there's other things changing over the sample period. Yeah. Okay. I didn't know that. I didn't know the back pass rule was a newer rule. I didn't know that. Well, maybe you could see here in England we get repeats of all sorts of matches from 30 years ago to kind of keep us occupied during the lack of football. And they've shown quite a few 1990 World Cup matches, and you just watch it and it's shocking that they just pass back to the keeper and he picks the ball up. This hasn't happened for for almost 30 years now. So there's been the nostalgia in the US because there's been some documentaries about old basketball being on, and you realize when you watch those, basketball was a lot worse back then. It's like slower, everybody's slower and smaller, and yeah. Yeah, there are some good football Twitter feeds about when football was crap, which are well good.
We're going to have to argue about the better basketball. It was a team game. It was a team game, not superstar driven. Now it's one game of 1-on-5.
Well, I don't miss those like 90 to 84 Eastern Conference Knicks games, but we'll have to argue about that.
All right.
Excellent. Well, I guess we'll wrap it to a close and say thank you again, Jamin, for what's been a really interesting talk. Generated a lot of discussion, both in the chat room and with the people. And as Jamin suggests, please do get in touch with him if you have particular questions that you want to raise. As I draw to a close, I'll just once again share and flag next week. So next week we have Roses, but Roses will be part of the Sports Economics and Sports Management International Conference, which will be an all-day event. And I will send you all an email related to that in terms of how to access that. It will be on Zoom. But very much looking forward to that next week. So thank you once again, everybody, for being part of this week, and stay safe, have a good weekend, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Hey, James.
Thanks.